in the last session, I shared something about my own experiences with higher consciousness, beginning with things that were artificially induced, and then into things that were really spiritually induced. And it really created in me a real thirst to pursue that further in my life. So I was thinking about this session, and I was thinking about the first session in relation to the session. I was thinking in the first session, we talked about the divine theme that Meher Baba gave us, which is an explanation of the purpose and the structure of creation. What's creation really all about? And in the first session, I think it brought us all to the starting line. In other words, it's the first session we talked about how creation began, that it was a response to the latent unconscious God in the beyond state, wanting to know who am I, and to create a vehicle for that. That's what creation is. It's a vehicle for God to go from the unconscious, infinite unconscious state to the state of knowing who he really is, or she, if you prefer that pronoun, who they really are, but this time consciously. And that involves, of course, going through the entire process of evolution of consciousness, beginning with the most primitive forms of gaseous and subgaseous experience, all the way through all the various other kinds of forms up to the human form, at which point consciousness, according to Baba, is full and complete. And then we have the whole process of human reincarnation to work through all of the impressions or sanskaras that we got from the evolution of consciousness through form. But then we also accrue more and more sanskaras or impressions that bind us and create veil over us from knowing, that keep us from knowing who we really are. And those experiences are in the human form. But at some point, as we start to balance out those sanskaras, that our consciousness starts to become finer. That's a word that Baba would use. And as it becomes finer, because the sanskaras are less and less of a veil, at some point, these sanskaras, instead of binding us to an idea of who we are as being a false identification of who we are, that those false identities start to get somewhat fainter. And then as that happens, there emerges this sense of, well, maybe there really is something beyond all of this false identification of who I am. And maybe there is something truer and higher and deeper of who I am. And that's the point in the whole process that we talked about last time, saying that that's when the human drop soul, to use Baba's term, then actually begins to have a glimmer of a sense of there really is a spiritual reality that I could attune myself to. Now, that's the place, when I said that we're getting to the starting line, that's where I think all of us on this call probably are starting from, is this place of having perceived this glimmer of possibility. So this session is going to take us beyond that. It's going to take us into realms that I suspect few, if any of us, have had the conscious experience of, or much conscious experience of, and it's going to be into the realm that Baba called involution. And I should say that from what I know and from what I can see, that Meher Baba's explanation about involution, and involution is about the journey beyond this, and it's a journey through inner worlds, and it's a journey through 6 planes of inner consciousness that Baba said one traverses as they get finer and finer in their consciousness, up to the point to which they are prepared to actually make the transition back to God by answering in finally the question, who am I? And answering the question finally to say, I am God, I am infinite in consciousness. And that's the fulfillment of what creation was all intended to accomplish. So Baba gave this explanations about involution. He started giving them actually in different forms back in the 1920s, and then more and more he gave them, and finally in the book, what I would call his magnum opus, as God Speaks, he gave a full explanation, complete with charts and graphs. And it's very interesting that he did this, because one might naturally ask the question, if this is the first time that this kind of information has been widely available to people. I'm sure it was available to people who were on the mystical path and who were working directly with masters before, but this is the first time it's really out there. And so the question, well, why is it out there now? And I think, I think the answer to that is largely found in the fact that Baba said he is the avatar. He is the direct incarnation of God in human form. And the avatar, according to Baba, comes periodically. He takes form every 700 to 1400 years to give a spiritual push to humanity. And when he comes at different times in human history and human preparedness to receive the avatar's message. Now, the avatar's message, Baba said, is always one and the same. It's always love God in one another and become God. But the avatar does appear in different times. He adopts the clothes, the garb, and the language of the people at that time. And so the emphasis of the avatar's teaching is always different. So for example, Baba said that when the Buddha came, Buddha was the avatar, that when Buddha came, the world was steeped in materialism. So the emphasis of the avatar was on detachment at that time. And we know that from Buddhist teaching. Then when he came again at the time of Krishna, Baba said there was a joylessness in the culture at that time. And so he came to bring joy back to the pursuit of God. And the whole concept of bhakti yoga became very widespread then. When he came at the time of Jesus, he said there was a great deal of cruelty in the land. And he came there to turn the other cheek and kindness and love thy neighbor as thyself kind of teachings to overcome the tendency for cruelty. Well, we live in a very sophisticated intellectual scientific age, and Baba has come into this age, and this is an age that is prepared for and requires that the avatar give us a teaching that makes sense to us from that kind of perspective. And so he's given us this very detailed information about the nature of, especially of involution, which had heretofore not been widely known. And in fact, Baba indicated that there's actually more that he's going to be giving us through a book that he wrote in 1925-26 time period that is so far not seen publication, but Baba assures us that it will. And my suspicion, and again, this is just my interpretation, is that that book will contain a great deal more information about these inner planes of consciousness, because Baba said, to receive that book, one would have to be spiritually prepared for it, which suggests to me that it will be as a result of a more spiritually awakened time of our culture when that information becomes available. Another thing I want to say about tonight's session, in the last session, I used a lot of great photographs to illustrate different phases of the evolution of consciousness through forms of animals and trees and so on. And I got a lot of feedback that people enjoyed those. Well, this session is really about the inner planes. And as far as I could find on the internet, I didn't find very many photographs of the inner planes of consciousness. But what I did find were some very beautiful paintings by a great mystical artist named Marika Popovits. And so she has very graciously offered me to use those for this presentation. So I'll be using those. They're not photographs, they're simply images that evoke for me the kinds of inner experiences that we'll be talking about. I want to say one other thing about this session is I'm going to be drawing quite extensively on Baba's own words here. And I think that that's really significant. You know, Baba said, he said, words that proceed from the source of truth have real meaning. And I think that that's really important to understand, because when we read books, when we read the words of Meher Baba, they are more than just intellectual concepts, that there is a kind of a transmission that comes with them. And there was a man named Don Stevens who was a very close disciple and follower of Meher Baba. He actually co-edited the Discourses and God Speaks, probably considered the two major works associated with Meher Baba. He co-edited those. And Baba said to Don Stevens at one time, he said, how important the words themselves were, because he had attached, and this was what he said, something like a spiritual atom bomb to each word. In other words, these words carry a very particular power. So I am going to be reading some of these words, especially about the planes of consciousness tonight, and hopefully we can all sort of take in some of that energy from the explosion of that inner atom bomb inside of our hearts. So, having said all of that, I want to start off with where we left off, and I'm going to switch now to the PowerPoint presentation here. So this is the chart from God Speaks that we talked about, and this is where you can see that the human beings have come near the. Here, let me turn on my laser printer. Here we go. We've come here to this spot here. I don't know if you can see the laser pointer, but it's showing the individual on their knees reaching toward that something higher that they're sensing, and they're now at the very, they're getting towards the end of their experience in reincarnation. And they're getting ready to enter into the planes of consciousness. And these are the planes of consciousness that Baba spoke about. So here's what Baba says about the readiness of that soul to actually undertake this next phase of the journey. Baba says, when one's experience of this world is sufficiently mature, the repeated disillusionments in life set one on the right track to discover what is missing. From that moment, the individual seeks a reality that is deeper than changing forms. This moment might aptly be described as the first initiation of the aspirant. From the moment of initiation onto the path, the longing to unite with the source from which he has been separated becomes articulate and intense. Just as a person in a tunnel longs for light all the more intensely after he sees a streak of light coming from the other end, the person who's had a glimpse of the goal longs to hasten toward it with all the speed he can command. So up to this point in our journey, all of our experiences have taken place in the realm of that that Baba calls the gross world. It's the world that we associate where our experience is through our senses, our five senses. But this body, and it's fully developed in the human form. It's partially developed before it gets there. But in the human form, we actually are made up of three bodies. We have the gross physical body. We have what's called the subtle body, which comes from the subtle world or the world of energy. And we have the mental body, which comes from the world of mind. And all of these three bodies interpenetrate the gross body. But while for the most part, we are simply not aware of these other two bodies, but they're actually the source of our experience. Our desires and our emotions are filtered through the mind of thought, and that they're energized through the subtle world, and then we experience them through the gross body. And we think we're just in the gross body, but we're actually experiencing things that are actually emanating from these other bodies. So at this point, when we are right on this precipice in between the gross world and the subtle world, we're now about to enter into the first plane. And Baba's gone into a great deal of detail about what the planes are, including what the experiences of the planes, what are the powers or capacities, or to use the Vedantic word, what are the siddhis of these planes. He's explained what they are, and also what some of the challenges are when we're navigating these planes. Now, for the most part, I think for me, and I suspect for most of us, all of us on this call, we're not consciously experiencing these planes. But it may be that some of us here have had actually some glimpses of these planes. We've had some early experiences. I've known many people, and self included, who've had sometimes the experience of experiencing subtle scents or fragrances that are not coming from any kind of gross experience like that. And that, again, is just a hint of the experience of what might be the subtle plane. So Baba then says, when the consciousness of the soul is ripe for disentanglement from the gross world, it enters the spiritual path and turns inward. The gross impressions now become less deep. They become fainter or more subtle, with the result that the soul now becomes subtle conscious. This is the first step in the involution of consciousness, which is striving for liberation from the burden of impressions. A number of cycles of births and deaths in the human form have to contribute toward that ripeness of gross experience, which ultimately propels the consciousness of the soul unto the path of liberating involution, on which impressions become fainter and fainter and eventually disappear. Gross impressions become subtle impressions become mental impressions, and mental impressions are ultimately wiped out, leaving consciousness free to reflect the truth. And Baba uses the word truth and God interchangeably. So these are the planes of consciousness from the chart, and you can see they're divided into two spheres. We have the subtle sphere of the first, second, and third plane, and then we have a plane called the fourth plane, which Baba said is a transitional plane between the subtle world and the mental world. And then once we've transitioned, we're now in the mental world for the fifth and sixth plane. So let's now begin the journey that Baba has explained, and we're going to go through each of these 6 planes. We're actually going to go all the way up to the 7th plane in this. I wish I could give you the conscious experience of those things, but I am going to try to share as much as I can through Baba's own words. So this is what Baba said about the first plane. This is the stage when it's said that the human soul stands, as it were, on the line which demarks the gross world from the subtle world. The consciousness of this human soul experiences strange things. With his gross eyes, he sees glimpses of the subtle plane. With his gross ears, he hears celestial music of the subtle plane. And with his gross nose, he enjoys subtle scents. In short, the gross conscious human soul, partially on the first plane of the subtle world, experiences subtle impressions with gross senses. Gradually, with further involution of gross consciousness, the gross conscious human soul experiences completely the first plane of the subtle world. Now the gross conscious human soul is no longer gross conscious, but he is subtle conscious. This subtle conscious human soul gradually becomes conscious of the second plane of the subtle world. So there are 2 things that to me seem clear about this. Well, the first is what Baba himself has said, is that we talk about 6 different planes prior to the final emergence into God in the 7th plane. But Baba actually says these planes are further divided, and there are actually 49 different what he calls steps that one crosses as they go through the planes. So there are various stages within the planes, and Baba has even alluded to that in this description, because he says when you enter the first plane, we're still partially gross conscious and partly subtle conscious. But by the time we're fully in the first plane, we are no longer gross conscious. Baba made that clear, that once we're there, we're actually in a different state of consciousness, even though we may appear to a gross conscious person like we're normal people, but actually our experience is completely in this subtle world, which is the world of energy. I think this notion of these different, I think what Baba is trying to also say here, this is my impression, is these experiences that we have in this plane and in each plane, this is a world in and of itself, and it's meant to be experienced, it's meant to be explored. We're meant to have experiences that we assimilate and we meant to get impressions from that that then we can help as we integrate them. They prepare us for our further journeying through the first plane, because it's not like when you get to the beginning, you've actually gotten all the way through it. So we have to journey through the first plane and then prepare ourselves for the eventual movement into the second plane. So this is now what Baba says about the second plane. The subtle conscious human soul on the second plane is gradually gaining consciousness of the infinite energy of the subtle world, and is capable of performing tricks or minor miracles of lower degree. For example, with one wish, he can make a dry tree green. He can stop railway trains and motor cars, fill a dry well with fresh water, and so on. He is now totally unconscious of the gross world, although from all outward appearances, he remains and functions as an ordinary man, eating, sleeping, having feelings of pain and pleasure, etc. Yet actually, his involving consciousness experiences not the gross, but the subtle world, and creates subtle impressions only of the sights, scents, and sounds of the subtle world. Now, let me just make a comment here about miracles, because Baba refers to that in this description. Baba's made it clear that what we call miracles on the gross plane, we consider them to be violations of the laws of the gross plane. For example, I have a friend, a very wonderful friend, who can actually make cigarettes and things like that dance in the air or move things around. He's what's called a mentalist. Now, it defies our normal laws of gravity and so on, is what he does. But in fact, Baba says these kinds of capacities, while they do not conform to the laws of the gross world, they actually conform to the laws, in his case, of the subtle world. That's where these kinds of things emanate from. But Baba also said that there is no premium to be placed on the performance of miracles. Baba said that as long as they serve the interest of helping and serving other people, then they're fine. And there's nothing wrong with them. And they might even be beneficial to the one who performs the miracles. But otherwise, they have no value. So they're just, he calls them tricks here too. And in fact, he says if they're performed for the wrong reasons, for egoic reasons, or to hurt or harm other people, then they actually retard or even delay the growth of the individual who's doing the miracles. So Baba himself, as the avatar, he said he himself did not do miracles. Now, there are nearly 2,000 books written by and about Baba, and in them they're just filled with enormous numbers of experiences from his lovers and followers that one could certainly call miracles. But Baba himself said he didn't perform the miracles. He said he would only perform one miracle as the avatar, and that would be the miracle of the awakening of the heart of humanity. That would be the one miracle that he would do. He said everything else he would call child's play, and it was no value. Now, he said other things about miracles, so it's not that it's just one thing that he said, but I just wanted to point that out. So we're now on to the third plane. And this is what Baba says about the third plane. He says, here, the subtle consciousness gains greater consciousness of the infinite energy of the subtle world, and the soul experiences greater finite power. Here, he is capable of performing grand miracles, such as giving sight to the blind, restoring limbs to the maimed. Here, this subtle conscious soul is also capable of experiencing the different planes and worlds of the subtle sphere, just as a gross conscious human soul is capable of traveling from Asia to Australia or America using the gross vehicles at his disposal. So again, the subtle world is the world of energy, and all of these are planes of energy, and this is where the soul has all of these different capacities around of energy. And Baba says, these are whole worlds. We think of this world that we're in as a big world, but I think what Baba said is these other worlds are actually much, much larger than this world, and there's a great deal of traveling through them and a great deal of experience that a soul can have and will have on these planes as they traverse them. So these are not just sort of singular experiences, that when we get into the planes. Now we're ready for the transition plane. And here you see, going back to the chart from Rano, daily we see that we've been through the 3 planes. And you can see even from this chart, as you go from the first plane, you've got some fragrances through roses and so on. The second plane, you start to get energy moving around, and the third plane, it's even more energy. We've now gotten to where we're getting a sense of infinite energy, because that is the potential of the subtle world. And so we arrive at the 4th plane, and we've nearly completed traversing these planes. So we're in this threshold transition. One might say that we're at a crossroads, and Baba makes it clear that this is perhaps the greatest and most important crossroads that the individual will experience entirely on their road back to God. And this is now the transition between subtle world and the mental world of thoughts and feelings. And this is what Baba has to say about it. The 4th plane is partially of the subtle sphere and partially of the mental sphere. This 4th plane is known as the threshold of the mental sphere. On the 4th plane, the soul is fully conscious of infinite energy. It is the very same infinite energy, which is the shadowy aspect of that infinite power of God. And I'll say parenthetically, Baba would sometimes refer to the creation as the shadow of God. And so when he says that, he's saying within creation, this is the reflection of that shadow, of God's shadow in its full infinite form as it relates to energy. Back to Baba. Here the soul is equipped with full power and is even capable of raising the dead and of creating new forms and worlds breathing with life. The subtle conscious soul on the 4th plane is confronted by the full blast of intense desires and emotions, which are the aspects of mind, and Baba capitalizes M for mind, of the mental world. At this stage, the soul experiences, as it were, a state of the darkest night. The overpowering incitement by intense desires to wield and use this infinite energy at will proves a treacherous foe at this juncture, when the involution of consciousness of this subtle, conscious human soul, unfailingly progressing rapidly towards gaining mastery over all desires. Now, this is my words now. It's now at this juncture that if the soul misuses the powers, Baba says the soul runs the risk of regressing, and could regress actually all the way back to the stone stage, and they would have to, if that happens, they would then have to replicate the entire journey, the whole evolution of consciousness, through the evolution of forms, through human reincarnation, so on, back to where they had gotten to before. This is if they seriously misuse their powers. And Baba goes on to say, and I mean, it's just it's so stunning to imagine how devastating that would be. But Baba says this disintegration of consciousness occurs only in the case of 4th plane consciousness, and that too rarely. And only when the powers of the 4th plane are misused. It is a fact normally that when consciousness is gained, it can never be lost. But in the case of 4th plane consciousness is the one exception. I remember Baba's sister Mani saying, and she said this, and Mani was one of Baba's very, very closest disciples. Baba said she would become a perfect master, I believe, in her next life. But she said that that Baba had said that her way of putting it was that it's always a going forward in consciousness. One never goes backward. And this is the one exception, is on the fourth plane. It's why this is such a critical place. And when we talk about making good use of powers, what Baba seems to mean is harnessing powers for the spiritual well-being or well-being of others. And a bad use would be increasing the bindings or harming others in that way. And it's interesting that this is a painting of Saint John of the Cross, who was one of Baba's favorite saints. Baba said he was on the fourth plane of consciousness when he wrote the book, The Dark Night of the Soul. And he said the Dark Night of the Soul is in fact his account of what is involved in crossing through the fourth plane of consciousness. Now we use this as a metaphor for going through any dark times of our lives very often, but Baba said this is actually what the Dark Night of the Soul is actually about. Okay, so we're now ready to make the transition into the planes of the mental sphere or the mind. And this is what Baba says about the fifth plane. With greater involution of consciousness of the subtle conscious human soul on the fourth plane, the consciousness of the subtle conscious human soul identifies itself with mind of the mental planes and experiences of the mental world. The mind of the mental planes has two sections. In the first section, the stage of mind is inquiring or reflecting. In this state, mind functions as thoughts, high thoughts, low thoughts, good thoughts, bad thoughts, material thoughts, spiritual thoughts. In the second section, which we'll get to when we talk about the sixth plane, the state of mind is impressive or sympathetic. In this state, mind functions as feelings, feelings of sufferings, emotions, feelings of desires, longings, feelings of pangs, separation, and so forth. Thus, the mental world has two domains, the domain of the fifth plane of consciousness of thoughts and the domain of the sixth plane of consciousness of feelings. So Baba says that when we reach the mental plane, our final progress is completely assured, and there will be no backbiting. Baba does say, and this is very interesting, that on the fifth plane, one is actually not capable of performing miracles because they're no longer conscious of the energy of the subtle world, which is where Baba says miracles come from. Also, a fifth planar is able to control the mind of the subtle conscious soul, however, so they can control thoughts of minds, other minds anywhere in the universe that are of souls that are lower than their own plane. And it's also on this plane that if there is a soul on the fourth plane going through the transitional state and they are starting to run the risk of actually abusing their powers, that the fifth planers will be monitoring these fourth plane souls. And if they see that they are on the verge of misusing their powers, they will intervene to prevent that from happening. So there is a kind of protection that fourth planers have when they go through that. So I want to show you just a few photographs here of some individuals that Baba indicated were on these planes. The first on the left is Swami Vivekananda, the great disciple of Ramakrishna. Though I have heard subsequently that Baba did say that Erich Jesawala, one of Baba's disciples, closest disciples, said that he was God realized. So perhaps that happened during the course of his lifetime. But I believe Baba did say he was on the fifth plane at least at some point. The man in the middle, some of you may recognize, his name is J. Krishnamurti. He was actually embraced by the Theosophists, especially by the head of them named Andy Besant, who believed that Krishnamurti was the avatar, was the current incarnation of the avatar in the 1900s. And Krishnamurti said that it wasn't true, he was not the avatar, and he dissociated himself from that assertion. And the man on the right is Hazrat Inayat Khan, who is the great Sufi who brought Sufism as we know it to the West. And the orders of Sufism actually, in his lineage, eventually became embraced and are now under the direction of Meher Baba through a group called Sufism Reoriented. Now we're on to the sixth plane. Here's what Baba says about the sixth plane. The sixth plane of the mental world is the state of full consciousness of feeling, and thus mastery over the control and creation of feelings is established, and no more scope is left for even a single thought to penetrate into the domain of feelings. The sixth plane consciousness is thoughtless and governs the feelings of the gross and subtle conscious atmas. Atmas means soul. This is often misinterpreted as mastery over the hearts of all gross and subtle conscious atmas. The loving of God and the longing for his union is really and fully demonstrated on the sixth plane. When even the sixth plane of the mental world is transcended, illusion vanishes and God is realized. The mental conscious human atma in the mental world has now only one sense, and that is of seeing. Now, the way I interpret this is because Baba said, when you're on the sixth plane, all you're doing is seeing, and all you're seeing is God. That's the entire absorption of the soul on the sixth plane. So what that means then is that they are consumed with the longing and the feeling of separation from God within them. And it's that longing that has been growing and growing through the entire spiritual process. It's now at its zenith. Now, one might say that a sixth planar is closest to God of anyone in this entire panorama that we've just been across. But Baba did note that the distance between the sixth planar and God is still infinite, just as it is infinite everywhere else. And it will require the intervention of a perfect being to facilitate that person's being able to make the leap across the infinite chasm between the world of creation back into the seventh plane, which is the plane of full God realization. Just to, again, to illustrate a couple of sixth planers who Baba talked about, and again, Baba didn't catalog every soul that we know about, but there were some that we do know. One of them on the left is Sri Aurobindo Ghosh, and he was the great yogi. Baba said he was on the sixth plane. He's actually a very unusual soul because Baba said he actually made it all the way up to the sixth plane without the help of any master. And Baba said that's exceedingly rare for that to be done and exceedingly difficult, but he did it. And then Baba, when Aurobindo dropped his body, Baba said he gave him a push from the sixth plane into the seventh plane. On the right, you'll see Rabia of Basra, who was a great saint. And Baba said that she then later, I think in her next birth, I believe, reincarnated as the great perfect master Hazrat Babajan, who is the one who gave Baba his initial awakening to what his stature was as God. So we're now at the place where we've seen God. We are then through the intervention of a perfect one, we have made the transition, and we are now in the seventh plane. And this is what Baba says about the seventh plane. This is otherwise known as the God in the beyond state. That means beyond creation. This experience of duality lingers on and on until the final involution of consciousness of the mental conscious human soul leads the soul to dissociate itself from the mind and makes the soul associate itself with its own self, capital S self, the soul, capital S soul, or Atma. Thus, the experience of the soul is now said to experience at last the consciousness of the seventh plane. Here on the seventh plane, the self-conscious human soul is conscious of himself as God and experiences infinite power, infinite knowledge, and infinite bliss, and is now also conscious of the source of energy and mind, which were nothing but the shadowy aspects of his own infinite power and infinite knowledge. Thus it is that when the consciousness of the Atma gained self-consciousness and experienced infinite power, knowledge, and bliss, the Atma realized that it exists eternally, that all through the travail to gain self-consciousness, the impressions, experiences, and associations of the gross, subtle, and mental bodies and worlds were nothing but a vacant dream, and that the identification with gross bodies, creatures, and human beings, and all the experiences of the three worlds and of the six planes with all of their paraphernalia had their relative existences sustained and maintained as long as the consciousness of the Atma was immature. Maturity was only gained in the seventh plane with consciousness fully involved. This led the Atma to realize the self, or made the Atma fully conscious of God realization. In other words, the Atma's own infinite state in Paramatma was consciously realized. Now, Baba says that on realization of God, if one realizes God when they're still in the human body, one of three things will happen. He said most souls will drop their body very shortly after attaining realization, and they'll just be in the non-dual state of infinite and eternal bliss. But some of them will continue to live in the body, and they'll radiate spirituality, and they'll benefit people spiritually that are associated with them. And these people are called majubs, or sometimes majub saliks. And they are able to make another person perfect themselves, what is called a jivan mukta. And then there are a very, very select few who gain God realization, the Baba said, will continue to function and take a responsibility for the well-being and the continued growth in consciousness of creation as a whole. And these individuals are called perfect masters, or sometimes called sadgurus. And at this stage, when they've reached the seventh plane, the drop soul has merged into the ocean that they actually came from. They started in the infinite ocean of unconsciousness. They came out of this drop soul. They went through the entire process and the entire journey in consciousness, and they're back again in full consciousness. You know, I talked last time about one of Baba's very close disciples, Kitty Davy, who lived with Baba for 15 years in India, and then served at the Mayor Spiritual Center for the remainder of her 100-year life, dying in 1991. And Kitty was just an extraordinary human being. And she gave a talk on consciousness once, and she gave many talks. And one of them she said, if there is a beginning to all of this, it's a beginning in consciousness. If there's a journey, it's a journey in consciousness. And if there is an end, if you can call it that, it's an end in consciousness. So it's all about consciousness. And this transition from the sixth plane to the seventh plane is referred to by the Sufis as fana thala. Fana means annihilation, and the Sufis very often will characterize the entire spiritual path as a series of annihilations that go deeper and deeper and deeper and become more and more consuming of the false self. And the word fana means final. And fana is the final annihilation, which is the final annihilation of the lower self. So I want to show you just a few examples of people that Baba said were all God-realized beings. The top three actually were all perfect masters. On the left is Sai Baba of Shirdi. And in traveling around India, I've noticed This picture of Sai Baba or some variation on is the most common picture I've ever seen in India, and it's all over the place, of any master. That Sai Baba shirt is very, very widely followed and known in India. In the middle is Hazrat Babajan, a Muslim woman who lived to be well over 100 years old, it is said, and was the person who unveiled Baba to his own spiritual state. On the right is the great Sadhguru or perfect master of Calcutta, Ramakrishna Paramahansa. On the lower left, somebody who is so well known and so well loved and appreciated now is through his poetry is Rumi. Baba said he became God realized at the hands of his master, Shamsi Tabriz. And on the right is a painting of another great Sufi Persian poet, actually Baba's favorite poet, Hafez, who became God conscious at the hands of his master, Fardun Akhtar. So those are all examples of God realized beings on the seventh plane of consciousness. The three at the top came back from that state to serve creation and all in creation in the role of perfect masters. It's very interesting to talk about, I think, to consider the difference between somebody who's on the seventh plane and others on the evolutionary path. This is something Baba said about them. He said, owing to their exalted states of consciousness, some advanced aspirants are worthy of adoration, but they are in no way comparable to God-realized beings, either in spiritual beauty and perfection of the inward state of consciousness or in their powers. You know, Baba made it very clear that it is not possible for us who are not on these planes to actually know whether somebody else is on the planes, and if so, what plane are they on? He said that that privilege is only accorded to those who are on the same or a higher plane than the individual who they are describing. So for those of us who are not on the planes, you know, we would have to rely on somebody who was on a higher plane, or hopefully a perfect being, who might, if it's ever of relevance for us, to tell us who these people are. Baba also said, and this is a very important point from Baba, he said he discouraged us from placing too much importance on the experience of these planes of consciousness, of having these experiences. He said that they obviously have their own purpose, they have their own value, but he said they're not to be valued as an end in and of themselves. One time Baba said something like, to be on a planes of consciousness, yes, you may be more advanced than somebody on the gross plane, but he said it's really like trading your iron chains for a set of gold chains. He said, yes, they're nicer chains, but you're still bound, and the goal is freedom. So those were the perspectives of Meher Baba, God conscious on the seventh plane, speaking to us so that we have proper perspective about the relative value of these different experiences of the planes. Now, we've been through the planes. I want to cover a few more things with you that hopefully you'll find interesting and important. And, you know, Baba gave us all this information for a reason. And while I don't claim that I know the reason, I suspect it's because somewhere Baba wants us to lodge this information in our awareness, because it may be relevant for us in this lifetime, or it may be relevant for us in some future lifetime. But hopefully the more we can absorb it, the more it'll form part of our intuitive awareness when we're ever confronted with the situations of the situation where we're in the involutionary process. So I want to talk about a few of the pitfalls or hazards that Baba pointed out about the involutionary process. And the first one I would call enchantment. And again, this is not to say, this is not what I would call a hazard, but it is something where we can potentially get lost in a state, these states of consciousness when we're in the period of involution are extremely intoxicating states, and we can get lost in states of enchantment. And people that get lost in these states of enchantment are called musts. That's spelled M-A-S-T, or sometimes in the Arabic, they're must-e Allah. And this is, Baba said, a must actually can look like a crazy person. He said it really takes a spiritually aware person to tell the difference between an insane person and a must. But he said there is a world of difference between them. He said a mad person is a person whose mind is going fast. He said a must is a person whose mind is almost stopped. And these are people that are having extremely advanced states of consciousness, but they have gotten lost in their states of consciousness. And so they're kind of stuck or delayed in their progress through the planes. And Baba did a great deal of work with these musts. We'll be talking about that quite a bit when we talk about Baba's life and work in the 5th session. This is a photograph of Baba with one of his favorite musts, a man named Muhammad, who was, Baba said, was on the 5th plane. I think he eventually moved up to the 6th plane before he dropped his body. But this is just one of thousands, of many hundreds, if not thousands of musts that Baba contacted and worked with. And again, it's very important work that he did with them. And also, this is a book, and you can get this, you can download this book directly from the Avatar Meher Baba Trust website, which that information is available on the Journey in Consciousness website, how to access that. But this is a book called The Wayfarers, and I am told it is the only book of its type ever been written, and it's about Baba's work with these, what are called the God intoxicated, but that's another term for musts, where Baba gives a discourse explaining what are musts, and then there's a whole review of Baba's work with musts that went through the 1940s. It was written by the gentleman on the right, whose name was William Donkin, a very great disciple of Baba. He was an Englishman, a physician, lived with Baba for many, many years in India and served him fully. This is another pitfall, is a misuse of powers, because again, it's very obvious that on the planes you acquire powers. And they can be used for good purposes, they can be not used at all, or they can be used for egoic purposes or even for destructive purposes. And Baba said to be aware of this. You know, I remember many, many years ago, and I'm going to really have to quote this from distant memory, reading the aphorisms of the great yogi Patanjali, who had a series of aphorisms about yoga. And one of them, I remember him saying, beware of fallen yogis with powers in high places, because he said this is the great danger of yoga, is gaining all of these powers, but using them indiscriminately or not without sufficient discernment, and therefore becoming kind of stuck or retarding their progress on path. So it's really a very important understanding about why it's so important that one does not enter into these planes until one has had a sufficient spiritual preparation. And that preparation means that it's a very important unburdening of one's own being from the burden of sanskaras and impressions that would drive one to behave in egoically satisfying ways. So we don't really want to get into these experiences unless we really have the preparation. This is the third one, pitfall, that I would highlight for you. It's the third of three, which I call delusion. And another way of putting it is having an unrealistic sense of believing oneself to have gained real mastery and setting oneself up as a master before one has actually achieved the real stature to be a master. And the reason why this is particularly dangerous, this, by the way, is a book by a wonderful Baba lover named Rick Chapman. It's a fun book if you can find it. But the reason why this is so important is because when you become a master to another person, that person becomes your disciple. When a disciple, and one of the primary things a master does is take on the sanskaras or impressions of disciples. Well, to do that safely, you have to be in the position of being able to dissolve those sanskaras yourself, which is only possible on very high planes. So if one is not actually already of that capacity and you start attracting disciples, they'll start laying at your feet their sanskaras, and then you're stuck with them. And then you have not just your own sanskaras to work on, but you've got the sanskaras of your disciples. So this is not a good thing. And Baba was extremely particular about people not accepting homage, accepting these kinds of things where people surrendered to them. I remember being with one of Baba's great, wonderful disciples, Alabo, one of his very oldest disciples, when he was being given a gift book by somebody who he had befriended, and the woman who gave it to him, it was a book of Hafez poetry by a woman whose family published some beautiful books of Hafez. And she wrote in the book, "To my friend and teacher, Ali Akbar Shah Puzanam," was Alaba's actual name. And when Alaba read that, the first thing he did was he took a pen and he crossed out where it said "and teacher." He was very particular, as Baba was with all of us, about saying, do not ever accept that kind of homage. It comes with great danger and great burdens. I also want to say a few words about the importance of a master in all of this. He's made it clear that especially when one enters the path of involution, and certainly before that as well, but especially when one enters the path of involution, it's of immense benefit and value to have the guidance and support of a master, because they know the territory and they can help guide one through the territory, and they can also create the circumstances and tailor the experiences of the individual crossing the plains so they're most advantageous to them, to their progress through the plains. And understanding all of this, these things that Baba has given us, these beautiful teachings about the plains and about the discourses and so on, it is never meant to be seen as a substitute to the aspirant for seeking the help of a master. In fact, one way of looking at this, especially when you get into the discourses that Mayor Baba gave, is a lot of them are really about how one can better avail themselves of the help that is unceasingly available to the aspirant from a master. So, because the information Bob has given us about these plains makes it clear that traversing these plains is not child's play. It can be very tricky, and it can be overwhelming, and it can even be dangerous. And so having somebody there who really is a master of these plains and can guide one through it can be of immense value. Now, I want to address another point here about the plains, which is to talk a little bit about Mayor Baba's followers in the plains. I recognize that many people on this call may not be Baba's followers, but this is still worth knowing about, I think, because there's a belief amongst some folks that Baba, that Baba takes his followers through the plains, but does so blindfolded. Now, it is true, if one really looks at Baba's life and Baba's work with his lovers and his followers, that it was very rare that he gave his followers experiences of the plains. There are a few cases, and they're very particular, but it is not common. One of the cases was Baba created a school for boys in India at Mehrabad, which was his center of his operation in central India. He created a school in the 1920s called the Hazrat Babajan School. And a section of that school was called the Prem Ashram. And this was a very select group of the boys who were spiritually prepared for it, received kind of a spiritual development as the primary focus of their education, even though they had their normal education as well. And there are three of those boys in particular that Baba gave experiences of the plains. The boy on the top left is named Esfandiar Vasali. He's a Persian. And Esfandiar was given by Baba in Premashram in the 1920s, the experience of the third plane. Now, there are many of us in the Meher Baba world who met Esfandiar in the later years. My understanding is that he progressed quite a bit from the third plane, I believe, to the fifth plane, maybe the sixth plane, before he dropped his body a number of years ago. But Baba gave him that experience of the third plane, which stayed with him. The boy on the right is named Aga Ali, and Baba gave him the experience of the fourth plane. I believe he's 14 or 15 years old at that time. He gave him the experience of the fourth plane, And again, he had all the protection that Baba could give him there, an extraordinary experience that he gave him. And the boy on the lower left, Baba gave the experience of the sixth plane of consciousness. His name is Chota Baba. Now these are very notable because they're really quite the exception and certainly amongst his closest mandali. Baba called his closest disciples mandali, which means circle. It's a Sanskrit word that means circle. I don't think any of them had any experiences of planes that I know of. So, but again, a lot of Baba's followers do believe, based on things that Baba himself has said, that Baba leads his followers to the seventh plane, but they leads them through the veils blindfold. And one can certainly find that within what Baba says. But I also want to give a counter view to it, just to sort of keep the discussion open about this, or consideration open about this. One of Meher Baba's very closest followers was a man named Bal Kachuri. And Bal Kachuri wrote many books about Baba and received many messages from Baba very directly. He was Baba's night watchman for much of the time he was with Baba, and Baba would give him the points that he wanted included in Bao's books at night when he was doing night watch. So Bao had a lot of very direct knowledge from Baba about many things. And Bao did say, and I've heard him say this directly, that everyone will eventually have to reach the seventh plane by going through the planes of consciousness themselves consciously. He did say, and I'm going to just preview what we're going to be talking about in a later session. He did say that Meher Baba had said that his work would be for the universal spiritualizing of consciousness of all in creation, and that it would, in effect, his word was kind of make a hole in the doorway to the first plane. He said the transition from the gross world to the first plane is the hardest transition to make in the entire spiritual process. And so Baba, through his universal work, it would eventually manifest that he will create a channel, and is creating a channel that will make it easier for those who are ready to move into the first plane of consciousness, and that everyone else in creation will feel more and more drawn towards the first plane as a result of this work. Well, I think that that's a really interesting statement, because in the last time period, I don't know what to call it, decade, 2 decades, there's certainly more and more awareness of this notion of energy. And it's in so many different spheres. I work in organizational realms as a consultant, and I certainly find that the concept of energy and the quality of energy is much more part of the conversation there. But even I do a tremendous amount of consulting in healthcare fields, and it is now true that in many healthcare settings, there are that they allow energy medicine, like things like Reiki and other things like that, to be practiced on patients inside of major medical centers, that it's been recognized that the whole concept of energy medicine has been recognized. So there seems to be a growing awareness and sensitivity and appreciation for this whole consciousness of energy, which of course would be consistent with what Bal Kachuri has said about the opening up of the subtle world, which is now has more rays of energy coming from the subtle world into the gross world. So we have more awareness of it and more facility with that. So I wanted to give you that perspective. I want to share with you one final thing before we sort of wrap up here. And this is something that I think is really interesting and really illuminating. It's the experience of a very close follower of Meher Baba, whose name is Amiya Hazra. And Amiya Hazra was a very intellectual, very accomplished professor in India, very intellectual. He wrote a couple of books. One of them is called Memoirs of a Zetetic. A zetetic is somebody who demands proof or evidence before they will believe things. And he wrote a book, and it's all about his experiences with Meher Baba. And that also, by the way, is available for free download on the Meher Baba Trust website. But he describes an experience when he was pretty new to Baba, and he was getting to know about Baba. He knew about what Baba said about the planes of consciousness, and he thought he would test Baba. Now, let me just say, before I share with you his experience, that Baba has said, it is the prerogative of a disciple to a master in the early stages, in the first stages of that discipleship, to test the master to see if the master is genuine. And I've known many, many people where Baba lovers, not to mention my own experience, who have tested Baba in those early stages and found him to be completely genuine and trustworthy. But Baba says once one has done the testing of the master, then no further testing, basically no further testing is permitted, is allowed. So this is, but in Amiya Hazra's experience, he was very interested in this whole notion about the experience of the subtle planes, would like to experience them. So one evening he was lying on his bed and he prayed to Baba to give him this experience of the subtle, of the subtle planes. So listen to what he had to say about that. He says, a milky white light began gradually pervading the entire room, gradually increasing in its brilliance, but there was no extraneous source of light. I saw tremendous flares of colorful lights in the otherwise lightless room. The beauty of these colored lights was great and surprising. I closed my eyelids, but to my increasing surprise, it made no difference in the phenomenon of seeing. Instead, they increased in intensity and grandeur. A brilliant circle of golden light became visible in front of my sight. This ring or circle moved with a terrifying velocity towards me. I was almost getting panicky. Then a sudden seizing sensation came in, which I found myself leaving home, the earth, the people, moving away at an incredible speed. I had no idea of the destination, but I moved so far away that I despaired of ever returning home or even to the earth. Well, that was the limit. I shuddered with deep-rooted revolt. I didn't want to be taken away from my dear ones to some place terribly far away. I now was compelled to make a prayer in misery to Meher Baba. Meher Baba, forgive me for testing you. Please send me back to my family. And as I prayed, the experience gradually began to wane. So in other words, Amiya knew that he wasn't ready to make the transition out of the gross plane. Baba said he didn't come to perform miracles, which he said generally miracles just get people more attached to the illusory world. They get more enchanted with the illusory world. Nevertheless, Baba said that he would fulfill anything that his lovers asked from the bottom and depths of their hearts. So it seems that Baba answered Amiya's greatest wish to experience the planes. And he experienced it as so overwhelming and so frightening that he asked Baba never to have that experience again. So it does really seem that these inner experiences of the planes are only given to us when we have sufficient preparation to be able to handle them. And as I said earlier, Baba said we should never seek out these experiences for their own sake, but he said we should simply focus on loving God and long for the love of God. So with that, we have now covered the full scope of the divine theme. So I want to recap, and I want to recap by looking at going back to God Speaks. And this is the dedication that God Speaks. And it's, to me, it's like the most extraordinary dedication I can ever imagine. This is how Baba dedicated the book God Speaks, is to the universe, the illusion that sustains reality. And I think that dedication in and of itself speaks to what the breadth of what it is that Baba is speaking of and what the authority is that he has to be speaking of. And then Baba then goes on to explain, through this entire panorama that we've now been over in these last two sessions, the entire purpose of creation and how creation actually works, beginning with the whim of God coming from the beyond state, where God is in the infinite state, but infinitely unconscious of who he is, and having the urge to know, who am I? and therefore having to manifest this entire creation as a vehicle so that he can answer that question as to who God really is. And that involves going through these three major phases: the evolution of consciousness, beginning with the most rudimentary forms of consciousness at the subgaseous and gaseous levels, gradually increasing in consciousness and awareness till it gets to full consciousness in the human form, and then experiencing in the human form the unburdening of the sanskaras or impressions from the evolution of consciousness, but gaining additional impressions in the human form that then also have to be unwound, and that eventually the unwinding gets to where the individual is now ready to sort of transcend the gross world and start and enter into the subtle world through involution, and then from there into the mental world as it completes its journey when it comes face to face with God on the sixth plane, and then with all the longing and the feeling of the intense separation from God, which then attracts the grace of a perfect one to help that individual answer that ultimate question by coming back to God in the beyond state, but this time fully conscious, and they can say, I am God, I'm infinite consciousness, infinite power, and infinite bliss. So we've now been through this entire journey of the divine theme. And here's what Baba says, because we now, this is maybe the first time in recorded history that we have such a clear and comprehensive and lucid understanding about what is the purpose, structure, and mechanics of creation. But there then is the question, so what? What's the value now? This hasn't been necessarily our conscious experience. What's the value of this? And here's what Baba says. This is the last chapter of God Speaks, the conclusion. Baba says, God cannot be explained. He cannot be argued about. He cannot be theorized, nor can he be discussed and understood. God can only be lived. Nevertheless, all that is said here and explained about God to appease the intellectual convulsions of the mind of man still lacks many more words and further explanations, because the truth is that the reality must be realized and the divinity of God must be attained and lived. To understand the infinite eternal reality is not the goal of individualized beings in the illusion of creation, because the reality can never be understood. It is to be realized by conscious experience. Therefore, the goal is to realize the reality and attain the I am God state in human form. So where do we go from here in this journey of consciousness? We now have explored the divine theme. We now understand what Meher Baba said about what is the structure and the purpose of creation and how does it all work. But now the question then I think naturally rises, okay, I understand that, but what does this all mean to me? In other words, how can I make use of any of this knowledge for my own spiritual progress? And that actually brings us to looking at what can we actually do to begin to further awaken, because everyone here is already in the awakening process, further awaken to our spiritual potential. So in our third session, which will be next week, we'll focus directly on that mechanism that Baba talks about, which is how we work with the impressions of the mind, or sanskaras. How can we best work with those in order to unburden ourselves of those so we can make our consciousness much more fine and much more receptive to our own spiritual ongoingness. And again, Baba uses this concept of sanskaras. He's written a great deal about it. It's going to be a very interesting conversation next week. And we'll also get into sort of everything about, because it really starts to integrate the whole world of psychology with what Baba had to say about the spiritual process. And Baba did say that his teachings about sanskaras are actually the basis of all of his teachings. So it's a most important concept, and that we'll be talking about. I think hopefully you'll find it really interesting And through that, I think hopefully we can all see how we can better exercise our own sense of self-responsibility as we attempt to progress our own consciousness. So I do hope you're all able to join in for that session. We do that at your appreciation, at your own. And this session is being recorded. You can listen to it again, or if you have friends who might be interested, it'll be posted on the website in a day or so. Again, I want to end with just a moment of silence, just as we began, so we can sort of absorb this experience or drink in what Baba may have given us through having spent an hour here focused on him and what he has had to offer us. I also want to, again, say appreciation to folks who have helped out with this session and helped out with the preparations for it, especially to Ali Lawton, who's been on as my technology partner here. And again, I want to invite all of you who would like to and who have the time to do it to stick around. We're going to take a moment for those who aren't going to stay here to kind of go ahead and leave us. And then those of us who stay, Ali's going to organize us into some breakout groups. Let's see if I can stop the share here. Just